She walked through the snow, her paws sinking into the drifts, but she didn't stop. Every step was a struggle for survival, yet almost all hope had already faded inside her. Suddenly, through the cold, she heard footsteps, someone's steps approaching her. She froze, and her heart began to race. This was her chance. Or was it another betrayal? Everything would be decided in the next second. What happened next? Would she be saved or abandoned once again? Through the dense silence of the forest, occasionally broken by a cold breeze, a faint, almost inaudible sound could be heard. Erica sat among the trees, her back pressed against the harsh trunk, her heart pounding wildly in her chest, feeling the weight of solitude with every beat. Everything around her was covered in a white blanket of snow, which glistened under the dim light of the gloomy sky, and each step she took left a mark, as if her life, her very existence, were nothing but a fleeting, fragile imprint, disappearing with every gust of wind. In this forest, everything felt alien, and it wasn't just a feeling, it was a truth that seeped into her being with every breath. The forest seemed ready to swallow her up, like it had consumed everything living that had been left forgotten here. Every tree, every bush, every solitary cloud drifting in the bleak sky was hostile. Everything around her screamed this truth, that she was alone here, abandoned, forgotten. Erica gritted her teeth and tried not to think about what had come before, not to think about how she, once loved, had now become unwanted. She couldn't remember how she had ended up here, in this forest. Her memory was full of fragments, cold hands that had pushed her away from the doorstep, and the angry gaze that told her she was no longer needed. They had gone, left her here, in this forest, in this cruel, endless loneliness. Every step she took was an effort, and every movement was accompanied by incredible pain. Her paws, numb and overwhelmed with fatigue, left tracks in the snow, as if her body were demanding more from her than she could give. She could hear each crunch of snow beneath her feet, hear how the air was hard to breathe, how her chest expanded and contracted, trying to find even a drop of strength to keep moving. But she could not stop. She couldn't. Around her there was only silence. The forest was empty and merciless, and Erica felt her once strong, agile body now trembling from the cold, from hunger, from fear. When she tried to hide behind the trees, her world became even more suffocating. The sounds disappeared. Only her breathing disturbed the nightmare vacuum, and every inhaled breath burned her lungs, but she could not stop. She had to keep going. Or what would happen to her? She couldn't tell how much time had passed. Hours, days, maybe weeks. But in the forest, everything lost its meaning. Time had no power over her. It was just as empty and pointless as everything around her. She passed over the same sections of the forest again and again, making repeated attempts to find something that resembled a home, even a little. But everything was cold and alien, like the gray, frost-covered trees whose branches bent under the weight of snow, like tombstones holding the darkness. Erica understood that she was incapable of finding a way. Despair burned in her eyes. She wandered, trying to guess where to go, where to seek shelter. But her heart had no hope left, no faith. Her mind was full of thoughts that maybe she would never return home. Her body had no more strength. She stopped, feeling her paws lose their footing, feeling her body turn into one enormous sensation of pain, a burning cold, and despair. Suddenly, her weak gaze fell on her paws, sinking into the snow. These paws, once so strong and confident, now drowned in the white cover, as if the very earth was swallowing her, as if the snow in the forest were absorbing her pain. She felt an inner aching sorrow, not for home, not for people, but for what had been lost, for someone who might have given her even a small portion of care. She lowered her head, hiding her gaze from the world. Tears, mixed with ice, covered her muzzle as she tried to understand what she was searching for here. Maybe she was just looking for the love that had been taken from her. Maybe she was hoping someone would appear again and extend a hand. She moved again, slowly and uncertainly, each step making her feel her body giving way. In her heart, the question grew louder and louder. Why? Why fight if it's all the same in the end? Why search if there is no meaning? Every step she took now felt like the last, an ominous feeling that perhaps there was no turning back. The wind struggled through the branches, whistling between the trees, as if trying to remind her that she wasn't alone in this world. But in her eyes there was only solitude. All that remained of Erica was a figure moving through pain and fear, now part of this dead forest. As if this place had become her final home, as if here, among these dark trees and endless snowdrifts, Erica had found her forgotten existence. The snow continued to fall, giving Erica no chance for rest. The cold wind, like an invisible enemy, pierced her fur, making every cell in her body shudder from the chill. Her once thick and warm coat now looked matted and dirty, a symbol of her downfall. Her eyes, full of fatigue and pain, followed each of her steps, and they were steps filled with fear and despair. She could no longer tell where night began and where day ended. Only the silent whiteness of the forest surrounded her, offering no way out. Step by step, she trudged further, barely finding any path, any sign that somewhere in this merciless world, hope still existed. But she knew that wasn't the case. The forest was as alien to her as every step she took. Hunger had become her constant companion. It gnawed at her from within, each hungry yawn making her body grow weaker. Her lungs barely took in the air, and her empty, weakened stomach ached with hunger. From time to time, she tried to find something edible, but the snow swallowed everything that could have been food. The leaves, rough and frozen, offered no comfort. And the rest of the life in the forest had long since disappeared. All that remained were the cold, gloomy trees standing like ancient sentinels in her way, and the silence pressing down on her. Each of her steps now became a battle. She moved slower, her paws losing their steadiness, her body starting to fail. The leaves, now turned into ice crystals, fell from the trees, creating sounds that made her anxiety rise. Fear had become a part of her being, and each movement was now a struggle against pain. She fought for every breath, for every step. Sometimes she fell. Her body, too weak, couldn't hold itself up and collapsed onto the snow, which seemed so soft but was in reality so cold and heavy. She tried to get up, but her paws were like lead, each attempt feeling like the last, and the pain in her chest tore at her with each new effort. But she didn't give up. She rose and moved forward again, despite the weakness, despite the exhaustion. Somewhere, deep within her soul, the last spark of hope still burned. When her vision began to fade and her breathing grew heavier, she suddenly heard a noise. A noise that made her heart skip a beat. The wind carried a strange sound to her, a faint, barely perceptible noise, but one that made her tense. She froze, holding her breath. It wasn't the sound of an enemy, but it wasn't a sound that promised help either. The noise was getting closer, and Erica pressed herself against a tree, hiding in its shadow. The sounds grew louder. She felt her heart racing faster. A silhouette emerged from behind the trees. Not a human. It was another animal. At first, Erica thought it was just a wild creature, but then she sensed something was wrong. It was big, strong, but there was something desperate in its eyes, as though it too was as lonely as she was. Erica stared into its eyes and her heart, gripped with fear, suddenly froze. The animal didn't move. It stood still, unsure of what to do, but Erica felt it. Its presence was both a threat and an opportunity. The animal remained motionless, and Erica, unsure of what to do, moved on. But after a few more steps, she sensed something was wrong. She froze, listening, and suddenly, from the dark forest, another silhouette appeared. It was a cat, its eyes full of fear. They were both frightened, but all three of them shared one common fear, the fear of loneliness. Erica continued moving, but her steps grew less certain. Her whole body was tense, weary, but the thought that she might still do something, that she might still be herself, caused her body to relax a little. Erica froze again. In the distance, she saw someone coming toward her. It was her salvation. Erica stood frozen, as if in a trance, listening to the sound that stretched through the silence of the forest. Everything around her was so eerily quiet that even her breath seemed too loud. Her heart pulsed in her ears, each beat ringing through her chest like a bell, carving its way through death. She glanced around and suddenly, as if in slow motion, her gaze caught sight of a figure appearing on the horizon. Her paws were seized by an instant paralysis. Through the snowy veil, a person was slowly approaching her. His figure was unclear and blurred by the faint light that barely pierced the clouds. He moved cautiously, scanning the forest as though he didn't even know what he was searching for. But she knew. He was her chance. A thin thread of hope, like an elusive spider's web, stretched between him and her painfully tired heart. At first, she couldn't believe what she was seeing. It was too late for miracles, and too much pain had been lived in solitude for her to trust anyone again. The faint, barely audible sound of his footsteps was more of a threat than a familiar sign. He could be dangerous. He could cause her even more pain. But staying still was worse. She was exhausted, her body begging for rest. But there was no peace. Everything inside her ached, and each step toward him felt like a thin line between despair and hope. She couldn't afford to think. Every instinct screamed at her to hide, to run away. But deep inside, beneath the layers of pain and fear, something soft began to awaken. Something fragile and misty, like the first spring sun. The man noticed her. It was obvious. His gaze slid over the white snow and stopped on her dark eyes. He didn't move, as though waiting for her to make the next move. Erica froze, her heart pounding wildly. She couldn't move. It was a moment where everything hinged on one question: trust or retreat into the shadows. And her body, broken by hunger and cold, seemed to know that one more step could be her last. But the man didn't make a move. He didn't come closer, didn't reach out. He stood still, as if evaluating the situation, as if peering into her soul, trying to understand what was hidden behind her eyes. Erica looked into his face, and in his eyes there was something warm, something familiar, but so distant, like a flash of hope in the dark night, which might never have shone. Could he be the one who could help her? But fear still held her tight. She tried to step back, feeling her paws weaken under the weight of the decision. Then, when she took a step back, the man slightly tilted his head. He didn't come closer, didn't say a word, but in his gaze there was so much understanding that Erica froze, unable to move further. Silence filled the space between them, but in her ears the silence rang like the last scream, like the final chance for salvation. He slowly, carefully extended his hand. Not suddenly, not threateningly. His hand, nonetheless, was firm and sure. It wasn't like the hands that had once abandoned her. It was warm, despite the cold, and in its calmness there was strength. Erica couldn't understand what was happening to her. She stared at his hand, trying to comprehend what she needed to do. Fear, paralyzing her body, resisted every impulse, but her heart was drawn more and more toward what was in his gaze. This wasn't a promise of salvation. It wasn't a guarantee of love. It was simply a hand that she could either accept or reject. And despite all the pain, despite the overwhelming sorrow, that hand became the light that illuminated her path. Erica's breath quickened. Her heart started beating again, but no longer from fear. He kept looking at her, and there was neither anxiety nor fear in his eyes. He kept looking, as if she were part of this world, part of something important. As if he didn't know what to do, but knew he couldn't leave. Erica took a step full of pain and doubt, a step that gave her strength. And finally, her paws, sliding across the snow, drew nearer to his hand. It was a movement that seemed impossible. But as soon as her fur brushed his fingers, the world around her shifted. The pain began to recede, as if she had found something long lost, not just safety, but real trust. The man's hand gently touched her head, and Erica froze. It felt as though she was returning to her life, but in a different form. In that moment, she couldn't understand what would come next. But for the first time in a long while, something like light appeared in her eyes. Hope. In that moment, she realized that what she needed wasn't salvation. What she needed was simply to be heard, to be noticed. Tears, unconsciously rolling down her cheeks, froze in her eyes. Days passed. Each step Erica took in her new home was more uncertain, as if she were still trying to comprehend what had happened to her. After that first meeting in the forest, it felt like she had entered another world. A world where there was no fear or pain. A world where she wasn't chased, where she wasn't abandoned in dark nights. In the room that had become her home, there was no cold, no despair. But there was no peace either. Erica cautiously explored every corner of the new space. The warm floor, the soft rugs, the unfamiliar smells. Her fur was still dirty and matted from hunger and cold, but her eyes were full of despair and anxiety. Every new movement from the person nearby was like a signal, danger or salvation. She couldn't understand why he was still here. Why hadn't he left her? Why hadn't he closed the door and cast her out? There were no empty corners in her new place, no forest, no cold, but everything else felt foreign. She hid under the bed, curling her body as if she could shrink so much that she would disappear. Her thoughts were scattered, memories of those dark days when she was alone in the forest, when there was no hope, when the emptiness inside her was filled with each painful, hungry breath. She still felt those pains, as though they were with her, like a shadow, as if no one could heal her soul. The man who saved her was nearby. She heard his footsteps, felt his presence, but still couldn't believe it. He approached her carefully, respectfully. He didn't try to rush her. He didn't try to make her into something she wasn't. He was just there. In his eyes, there was no fear, no anger, only patience. He crouched beside her hiding spot, and when their eyes met, Erica felt her heart freeze for a moment. It wasn't fear. It was a feeling she hadn't felt in a long time, safety, but there was fear too. Fear that this could all be temporary. Fear that she would once again be alone. She could feel the warmth of his hands as he tried to brush her fur, as she allowed him, like a command, to gently touch her body. But her soul couldn't forget the cold that had once been her only companion. And despite the warm room and the care, her heart still doubted. Erica couldn't believe that everything that had happened wasn't some kind of deception. She didn't believe in people. She didn't believe in the light that came after dark days. Her first day in the house felt like a dream that couldn't become reality. In her memory, the frozen image of that forest still lingered, a forest that was still part of her. She felt how its cold air still pierced her body, and each step through the house where she was safe, felt like a step into a new, foreign world. But how could she forget those nights when the night frost clawed at her body like the talons of cruelty, leaving scars on her heart? That night, when everything seemed drowned in silence, the man approached her. He silently extended his hand, gently stroking her back. His touches weren't hurried. They were steady, tender. She trembled, trying to move, but there was something in his gaze, something that made her stay. It wasn't love, it wasn't salvation. It was simply care, and that was enough. Gradually, she began to come out of her hiding place. She no longer hid under the bed, no longer tried to disappear. She started to feel that he wouldn't leave her. But doubts remained. Every glance at the door, every step through the house, was like a challenge to her old demons. When she looked into the eyes of the man who had saved her, she saw not only care, but also pain. As if he too had been through something that made him stay with her. Days passed, and Erica began to understand that perhaps her new place wasn't just a temporary refuge. She began to believe that here she could find a home. She started learning to trust again. But she also realized that despite everything, her soul couldn't be healed just by a house, nor by just a hand that cared for her. Her soul needed a long process of healing, slow and patient steps. The man became her salvation, but not in one day, not in one night. It was a gradual process. But each new day when she woke up and heard his footsteps, when she felt his hand, when his gaze met hers again, this was all she needed. Erica no longer feared being abandoned again, feared being forgotten again. She was not forgotten, she was saved, but in her heart there remained a quiet pain, a pain that reminded her of what she had been through. Erica had learned to live in the new world. She had learned to believe in it. She had learned to be happy, but she never forgot the dark forest that stayed in her memory, and in that was her true healing. Erica's new life was not painless. It was fragile, like a flower breaking through the snow, but it was real, and perhaps that was her salvation.